Today we're going to start another commentary on one of the books of the Bible. This book was considered to be so erotic and evocative that the Jews were not allowed to read it until they were 30 years old. Well, it is full of similes and metaphors, and I'm not sure that I'd actually be comfortable speaking about all of them. But today I want to go over an overview and to look at it from a literal point of view. So the first question that we really always need to ask is, why is this in the Bible? So we're going to answer that in part today, but the more significant reason or aspect of this book, we're going to address in the next week or so. So in this vein, it's interesting that the book that we're going to go over today is one of the 5 books known as the Megilloth, or another word for scrolls. And this book is the Song of Solomon. Now, the Song of Solomon is the first of 5 books in the series called the Festival Scrolls. These are the books that were read at certain times of the years by the Jews. Now, we always have to be careful about the Jews and their traditions, but I think there may be something to this and as to why they read it at this time of the year. They might not even know why this is. But here's the really interesting thing that we're going to get to eventually down the road, but is the fact that it's associated with the last day of unleavened bread. Okay, now we just finished celebrating that this past Wednesday, and we're always looking for the meanings and understanding of the holy days and what God wants us to see in his plan of salvation. So again, we ask the question then, why is it in the Bible? Because all scripture is profitable. Now, Solomon himself wrote 1,005 songs. All right, 1 Kings 4:32 talks about that along with the 3,000 proverbs. But this is the only one of his that's in the Bible. So we look at this, and again, one of the first and most outstanding things about it is this erotic love that is talked about. Now we know that God gave us that as a physical manifestation of our love. This book shows, that the man has it towards the woman and the woman can have it towards the man. But I don't think that that's the main reason that the book is in the Bible. So why is it here? You know, well, we're going to go over some of those reasons today and then more in the next week. Now, here's the interesting thing, though, in terms of the approach for today, and it's something that I really haven't ever done, but we're going to interpret this physical in light of prophecy and spiritual meaning. So we're kind of going backwards. Now, I don't want to give away the whole story just yet, but I want to use our established understanding of the Bible to give clarity to this book. So I'm going to take what we've learned, all right, what we've built and put together, and apply it to this book. All right, so typically, whenever you look at the Bible and you try to figure it out, we see that God gave us the physical to help us to understand the spiritual. And so, in a sense, we're looking at it backwards. We're looking at it, but we also know this, and I think we understand the spiritual aspects, and so I think we can apply it appropriately. And I think this, for me at least, was a necessity because when you start looking into the book, it can be incredibly confusing. And in many ways, it's more so than any other book in the Bible. And I'm including books like Hebrews and Revelation. So whenever we look at this and you want to try to make sense of it, I think that by applying this template, we can do that and it can give it all kinds of clarity. So it's a poetry, it's song, it's artsy. And just that alone, with all the metaphors and similes that we were talking about, can make it difficult to understand. Throw on top of that that there's multiple speakers as well. So when you try to tackle something like, one of the epistles of Paul, it's Paul speaking, to Timothy or to whomever, and it's just Paul speaking. And okay, it can be difficult to understand as Peter talks about Paul being, but we know what's going on. So, in looking at this book, though, you have several different characters in this song. All right, and it's kind of a ballad, or maybe it's more akin to a play or a musical or an opera or something like that, where you have several different characters, all presumably singing here. And again, I'm going to use singing and speaking interchangeably here, but whenever we look at this though, and that there's all these different characters, I say all, we're going to, I think, boil it down to three. It's sometimes difficult to figure who's saying what to whom. And so that's, I mean, a huge part of the background. So what we have here, though, is this narrative, as it were, of a man, okay, in this case, it's King Solomon, and a woman. Now, most people, when they look at this, they see and they believe that this discourse is between Solomon and the woman. And while it is in one respect, I don't think technically that that is the right way to view this. So, for the most part, what we see is Solomon talking to the woman or singing, and that's the direction of the flow of his words or the things that he's saying is towards the woman. Now, the assumption has been many times, and you'll see perhaps even in some of the notes in your Bible or the section headings, that they believe that the woman is then talking to Solomon in return, and that she is pronouncing her love for him. But I think more appropriately, what we're going to see, because everybody knows that the woman is talking about her lover, her beloved, okay, that they talk about. And this beloved doesn't really have a speaking part, though it's referenced that he does speak. But what we have here, though, is the woman talking about the lover, who we will see is the shepherd as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, too. Now, the other one, the other character or characters, are called the daughters of Jerusalem, who appear to be just other Israelitish women that are actually a part of the harem of Solomon. So they provide this chorus that interjects from time to time into the story. And so that doesn't help in terms of our flow. Now, so what I ended up doing just to help myself out is, to the best I could, and this may be subject to change as time goes on, but as most of the rest of the Bible is in terms of our understanding, I went and color coded the whole book of Song of Solomon. Now, yeah, I don't necessarily recommend you do that in your Bibles, but I have it in electronic form. And I went and I just made every time the woman spoke in pink and when the guy spoke in blue, and then just another color for the chorus, so that I could see kind of the going back and forth, because this song is what they call it's done as an antiphony. All right. Again, a fancy word for meaning back and forth. So it's anti and then phony, as in noise or words or voice. So it says against the voice. So it means it goes back and forth, as much of the Psalms have already been written in, where somebody says something and then you have a response from the other people. And it goes back and forth, and it makes for an interesting way of singing the psalm, or in this case, the book of the Song of Solomon. So now, as we go through this today, I'm not going to tell you about all the things that it can possibly be, just the ones I think fits in with the rest of the Bible. And because of, I don't want to spend so much time on this, though it's an important aspect, I believe the things that we're going to get into in the next week or so are considerably more important and to a large degree, much more exciting. But we have here this kind of ongoing courtship, and the way that uh, Solomon wants to have her as his lover, and the way she wants her original lover, and you see this going back and forth between them, and the love that is there. And so there are things definitely that we can glean from that, and of course, like I said, without going too much into the eroticism and sexuality, we're going to do a basic overview. Of course, if you have any questions at any time about some of these things, by all means, feel free to talk to me privately. So, beginning in Song of Solomon 1 and verse 1, it says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. So, this is kind of where we get the title of it from, the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. It's actually called both in different, I guess, circles. But obviously, what we have here is that Solomon is the author of it, and he's the accepted author of it. He wrote this. If you look at the order, in your Bible, it has it Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And so there's a certain presumption that that was chronological, though the Bible's not all chronological because it's, in some respects, difficult to make it chronological. But other people actually believe that Song of Solomon was written before Ecclesiastes, which may have some, I guess, insights that it could provide either way. But we're not going to focus too much on that, except to say that it was Solomon who wrote this. And, we know some of the story about Solomon, and we'll talk about that as well a little bit later. So it's called the Song of Songs here, which I think implies or connotes it to be the best, right? So whenever we talk about things like the Holy of Holies, you're talking about the most holy, or you're talking about the King of Kings, this is the king that is at the top. Well, I think that that's what it's meant to convey to us, is that this was the Song of Songs. And so even though Solomon, it features prominently in the book, I believe this is more about the woman than it is about him. And it's also, I think it shows, or it can lead to why, it may explain, there is confusion about the relationship between him and the woman, considering Solomon and his estate and his import throughout the Bible as, the wisest man and very rich and a prominent figure, being the son of David and whatnot. So I think people naturally want to say, oh, yeah, it's between Solomon and the woman. But I think, as I said before, be careful about the section headings. And I think also, as we go through, and we'll talk about this also here in just a bit, that you need to, if you have the right frame of mind, and again, we'll explain this more next week, as to how this fits in to the things we're going to be talking about, then you can see, okay, well, this makes more sense this way, rather than it's Solomon and the woman being the main characters here that are in love with each other. And so, with this other perspective, it clarifies some of the verses in a different way, and your focus becomes more along those lines. So I know that I'm asking you to trust just a little bit, but stick with me, hopefully, and we'll see these things. And again, this is a type of thing, obviously posted on the website, that you get to go over again and again, and you're going to need to, in terms of getting a greater understanding and seeing these things, or seeing them more clearly. So I think the central figure here, just to sum it up, is the woman that's referred to as the Shulamite. Okay, again, she's not even addressed that way until chapter 6, verse 13, but it's also, she's referred to as Shulamith, which I think is a little bit closer to the Hebrew. But again, she's called a Shulamite because they believe she came from an unidentified place called Shulam. Now, we say unidentified, that's a presumption, because even to this day, we don't know of a place called Shulam. Now, Strong's, if you look at it, uses this word Shulamith, which means or trends towards being peaceful, or meaning peaceful, right? So whenever you look at things, and here, this is another word of caution in all of this. I'm trying to, give you heads up in so many ways, but you look at Strong's and you say, well, this is an epithet for Solomon's queen. Well, he is presuming that she is queen and that the two of them are getting married, and it's about the two of them. So there's a predisposition, there's a bias that we're going to see even in the translating of, again, I'm reading from the New King James, but I also check the King James and other more literal versions to see what they're saying. But and there are these biases in terms of the translation, that make you believe this, or even these insertions, which are not even scriptural, makes you believe a different way. So be careful. Now, the interesting thing is about her name is that it comes from, according to Strong's, shalom, the word shalom, which, if you can kind of hear it, means to be at peace. All right. So shalom and shalom, two different words, but again, similar in meaning. One means to be at peace, the other is peace. Again, we know that the word shalom means peace. We say Shabbat Shalom, which means, have a peaceful Sabbath, or as we often say, a happy Sabbath. But shalom is actually a play on the word for Solomon, or Solomon's a play on the word for shalom, for peace. So the name Solomon means peace, and the name Shulamith also means peace. So whether this was uh, a real name, to me it seems like it's more a play on words, since we have a song here that's being written. It could be a pet name that he had made up for her, but I don't think it's really a real place. And because this is, to me, a made up song, though, some people want to say this is based on true facts. It could be, but the fact remains that, it's interesting, or, very coincidental, or, God orchestrated the situation, which is a real possibility, to make her name this. And so, again, you see the similarity. So, again, we're not going to get too hung up. I don't think it's a big issue where she came from, because, as we'll see later as well, but she is, referred to as the Shulamite or Shulamith, and that's most of what we have in terms of where she came from, and what her name means. Now, what we see, though, here as we get to verse 2, is that she's the first one to sing. So we have just the introduction, the Song of Songs, the author and the title. And then we see the beginning of the antiphony, this back and forth. And so she's going to sing, and then the male will sing, and then the chorus interjects from time to time. And so it starts out pretty hot and heavy. It says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. So as we go throughout, and we won't focus on this too much, she's quite passionate in her words toward her lover, who most believe to be Solomon. But notice right away here in verse 4, she says, draw me away. All right, the connotation of draw is to remove. Draw me away. We will run after you. Then she says, the king has brought me into his chambers. And so when I look at this, all right, and she goes on and she says, we will be glad in you. We'll remember your love. And before that, we will run after you, drag me away. But then she changes it right there in the middle. The king has brought me into. It didn't say you have brought me into your chambers. So it appears that, she was taken out of her environment and she's brought toward the king. And the king has his designs on her. Now, the king, again, we know Solomon wrote this, but we also see references over in chapter 3, verses 6 and 7, I think, that talk about King Solomon. Okay, so it's he is more than likely the king that is referred to. It seems unlikely that they're referring to Solomon here in the middle of it, and he's not the king. But there are references to Solomon. Some are indirect, some direct, and then you have the word king here. And so I believe it to be, and of course most people believe, because they believe it's between the Shulamite woman and Solomon that this is happening. So this is not a stretch, but what we're bringing to attention here in verse 4 is that it's the king that brought me into. And so she diverts and distinguishes between the two right off the bat here. So I see that that's a crucial and key verse in terms of understanding it, just based on it alone, just based on internal evidence. Then she goes on, she says, I am dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem. So she's kind of having a conversation with them. And what we see, she goes, I'm dark, but I'm still lovely. And she's talking to them. So there's automatically already this tension between her and the daughters of Jerusalem, who are ostensibly the harem that she is now being brought into. But verse 6, he said, don't look on me because I'm dark, because the sun has tanned me. So they tend to be, those in the harem they were more fair. They didn't have to work out in the sun. They had perfume and oils to anoint themselves, and beautiful dresses and jewelry to wear. But she says, she had to work out in the vineyard. And this word for dark here can mean, as the King James actually translates it, black. But and even later she talks about her lover as being black as a raven. So it trends that way to being very dark, but it also can mean just dark or dusky. So perhaps you could look at the raven part as being dark like a raven. But nonetheless, it appears that she is dark, and she's dark from the sun, or darker from the sun. Then verse 7, she talks about her lover again. And notice how she identifies him. Tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon. For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions, or the other fellows? So what we see here is that her lover is the shepherd, right? This one that she was in love with, that she had this relationship with, and the one that she longs for. And so we have it defined here. So sometimes you'll hear that the lover is her shepherd, or I may use those interchangeably. So then it goes on in verse 8 and says, if you do not know, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock and feed your little goats beside the shepherd's tents. So I want to give a caveat about accuracy here in terms of who exactly is talking, because if you go through this, it's very difficult to follow back and forth. And it really seems now that at this point in time, it's the daughters of Jerusalem for this single verse, now, verse 8, that is speaking. She addresses them in verse 7, basically, or again, she's kind of addressing them as she's going down because of this tension. She addressed them not 7, but verse 5. She addressed them. And then it seems like they come back after her comment about, wanting to be with her shepherd. And so it appears like they're giving her a hard time because of their jealousy, because Solomon now has this affection and attention based on her. And Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He had 1,000 women who I'm sure were all vying for his attention. And now here's apparently the new kid on the block, and they're jealous. And they're saying, well, look, if it's a shepherd you want, then go feed your little goats, your kids, beside the shepherd's tents over there. He's saying, again, the word shepherds is plural here. So the Shulamite is saying shepherd in the previous verse, and now they're saying shepherds. Well, if that's what you want, there's plenty of them over there. And they're just trying to say, maybe you should just go over there if that's what you want. If that's how, quote unquote, maybe lowbrow you are. So now I bring this up because as we go through this is where our perspective comes into play. So if you're under the impression that Solomon is the lover that she's talking about, then your mind makes a connection between verse 7 and verses 9 through 11. So she's talking about her lover in verse 7, and then the daughters of Jerusalem are talking about the shepherds. And then you see Solomon coming in, and now it looks like he's trying to grab her affection by flattery and ostentation. So verses 9 through 11, he uses complimentary language. So even though she's talking about somebody else, he comes in and he starts bestowing gifts upon her. And it's not necessarily because they have a relationship, but because he wants one. So what we're going to see is that she continues to focus on her lover, and Solomon continues to focus on her. So I think, by way of background too, it seems unlikely that Solomon went out and found these 1,000 women. No doubt he had somebody out doing some of the work for him to go into the countryside, to go into all the surrounding areas, to bring, these women back to him. And she was taken from her countryside home. Now, most would want this, but not her. And so now he has to continue to try to woo her. Now, here's the interesting thing about why not Solomon. Right? When we look at the Shulamite woman, if she was just one of 1,000, there wouldn't be anything special about her. They're all basically women that were in the same position in terms of their relationship to Solomon, Solomon's relationship to them. But what makes her stand out is that she shuns what Solomon has to offer and opts to remain true to her lover. So the problem, okay, again, is with Solomon. Solomon being the object of her love in the Bible. Solomon may be the worst example of what we should be looking for in a husband in the Bible. Right? Let's turn over to 1 Kings 11. Of course, keep your finger here if you'd like. 1 Kings 11, and put verses 1 through 10 in your notes. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 10. Solomon did the wrong thing in his pursuit of all these women. He did not follow God, and he paid the price for this. It says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughters of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites." So these are people from areas of Jordan, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon. So from all over. So it's not a surprise that this woman, even though she may have been dark by her natural skin color and became darker, could have easily been some foreign woman that Solomon had gone after. Now, continuing on in verse 2, he's taken these women from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. So he did exactly what God said not to do. And he says, if you do that, this is what's going to happen. And verse 3, and Solomon had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart, just like God said that they would. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, with a little g, that aren't gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David, who had a heart after God. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as his father did, following them, their ways, into their religions, their false pagan religions. And Solomon built a high place. These were the things that they were told to take down, to destroy these high places where they go up and set altars. For Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech. Really? He's building a high place for Molech where they sacrifice children to? The abomination of the people of Ammon? And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their God. So this is the direction that Solomon's going. These are the women that he chose. These are the values and the religion that they held, that he eventually adopted. And so verse 9, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who appeared to him twice. Some people would like to believe that, well, if God would just show himself to me, I would believe anything and everything he said. Well, the wisest man that perhaps ever lived outside of Jesus had him appear to him twice and still made these mistakes. In verse 10, and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. So, Solomon did not do what was right in the eyes of God. And this was the example that he set with as a husband to the women, to the wives that he had. And that was the direction that he went as he pursued everything that he wanted to pursue. He had that ability. And he was not a good example, especially as a husband that is to be desired. Ecclesiastes, you might want to put chapter 1, verses 13 through 18 in your notes. He sought out wisdom, and he tried everything under the sun, and he tried to understand what was right, quote unquote, in the world. And he went after earthly wisdom. And then chapter 2, basically the whole chapter talks about how everything was vanity and grasping for the winds. Everything that he ended up working towards and doing, that there was no profit in it. Okay, and then even verse 9 says his wisdom remained with him. So he was still this quote unquote intelligent person, this wise person. And yet these are the decisions that he made. And his conclusion, or the way he starts off Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So the stuff he did, especially in the wives, was fleeting, it was temporal, it may have catered to his self-indulgence, but in the end, it was not right. And he understood that. So again, we understand how smart Solomon was. God said, "What do you want?" And he asked for wisdom, and so God gave it all to him. But Ecclesiastes chapter 7, I might look at verse 26, 28. He says, and this is his summation of his experience with the women. He says, "I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters like handcuffs. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her." Verse 28, "Which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have, but a woman among all these I have not found." Again, we saw he had 1,000 women and he couldn't find one. And I don't think that the Shulamite was the one that he actually ever had among the 1,000. She remained outside of it. So when I look at Solomon in this vein, I don't see him as one to be desired or held up as a good example, even by his own admission. So I see his courting of the Shulamite was something in order to satisfy these pursuits that he had, the ones that we just got finished talking about. So I think we also need to realize that in the Bible, not all the examples are good examples, quote unquote. Some are given to us in order to show us what we're not to do, so we can thereby learn from that example. So in this context, as well as what we're going to bring out next week, I believe what we have here then is this Shulamite woman talking about pining over her lover while Solomon tries to gain her affections. And of course, this is all done in an artistic way. So some of it might be a little bit strange or abrupt or what have you. But yeah, I think it was done this way to make several points. So with this in mind, let's just do a brief overview and outline of the rest of the book. Of course, feel free to read it all in between now and next week, and perhaps more than one time. So back to chapter 1 of Song of Solomon. So again, I'll try to outline here, who is talking. And again, caveat still remains in place that, subject to change as maybe perhaps more insight is given or revelation. But verses 12 through 17 is the woman speaking or singing. And you see in verse 12 it says, "While the king is at the table." So again, it's her talking, and we look for these kind of contextual clues along the way to help us figure out who is saying what. Now there's some other ones that you probably won't be able to see because they're in Hebrew, and you see the gender of the noun or pronoun, and so you can see to a certain degree in that respect if it's a masculine or feminine, and some of those things help if you want to get into a really deeper study. But chapter 2 All of chapter 2 is her. So whenever you look at chapter 2, she starts off speaking, says, I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. And then verse 2, like a lily among thorns, so is my love among the darters. So she compares herself to a lily. Then verse 7, she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem. And so by the gazelles or by the does of the field, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. And she's kind of giving them an admonition, which she does several times in the book, that she is saving herself for her lover, and that they have been out of turn in doing what they have done, and all that's not going to work. And of course, we already know in hindsight, and even by Solomon's own admission, that yeah, it didn't work. It did not accomplish anything. It was vanity of vanities, and that he did not follow God's way, and he did his own thing, and that just ended up blowing up in his face. And to what degree that they actually ended up taking him completely away from God still remains to be seen, because that the words that they use in terms of the ones we were reading there in First King about how utterly they took him away from the way of God really, smacks of the unpardonable sin. So he rejected God in some way, shape, or form, if not to a greater degree. So again, the admonition is from her towards the daughters of Jerusalem that okay, there's a better way. And then verse 8 it says, the voice of my beloved, behold, he comes. And so again, the context is still her speaking here. And I just want to kind of point that out just so you know, and so you know what to look for perhaps in the future. And then verse 16, verse 16, which is the penultimate verse in the chapter, says, my beloved is mine and I am his. So again, talking about that relationship that we're talking about. And we see that she is still talking about him. And it says he feeds his flock among the lilies. So they only have eyes for each other. And it's interesting that, again, if perhaps this is a metaphor or something, uh, she is the lily that was mentioned up in verses 1 and 2. So, again, that's why we read verses 1 and 2 to see that she described her as a lily. And then you see that he is among the lilies. But again, not hard and fast, but something to consider as we go on. And of course, the context is still that she is speaking. Chapter 3. Now, what we have here in chapter 3 and verse 1, again, I want to just highlight some of the things that are going on in the chapter. Because, again, one of the things whenever we study the Bible is to look at everything in context. So sometimes that means going up and reading verses above or verses below or chapters before. And you have to put everything together and to be able to understand it better. But chapter 3, verse 1 says, by night on my bed I sought the one I love, but I did not find him. So by night on her bed she sought him. So what we have here is a dream sequence. But again, there's connotations to it here in that she's looking for it, and it shows perhaps a state of mind and things that were going on. But she says, I did not find him until verse 4. So she goes through a bit. In verse 4, she's still talking, and she finally finds him in the dream. And then verse 5, once again, she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem. So she's talking to them. So while they may have this lesser part to play in terms of being the chorus, you have the two main characters, and they interject from time to time, she nonetheless takes it upon herself. They were saying things to her, especially in the beginning, and now she's saying things to them. And as we'll see, I think that they start listening to her and believing her and agreeing with her a little bit more than they did, or obviously a lot more than what they did in the very beginning. So she tells them, she says, I charge you. And then she once again says, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. So then, okay, another admonition. Then what we see is that they then sing for the rest of the chapter. And in that, they talk about how great Solomon is. Of course, that's their view of it. And, we talked about that. It's like, who wouldn't want something like that, right? In terms of if you're a pauper or a poor girl in the country, and, here's Solomon in all of his splendor and all of his wisdom to be desired on a physical level, to take them out of that and to then give up certain things in order to be a part of his harem. So yeah, they think he's all, great, the bee's knees, that they go on for the rest of the chapter to describe him, and we also see, him called out by name at that point. So chapter 4. So in chapter 4, Solomon now speaks pretty much for the whole chapter. Okay? So all the way down except for, I think, verse 16. So as he goes through, what we see is kind of what we are talking about before, is that he continues with these terms of endearment, trying to gain her favor. And this is kind of what he's doing throughout, always trying to, use these lines that have always worked for him in the past. Now, the other interesting thing that I point out here is that it may allude to the fact that she's still a virgin in some of the metaphors that are being used. And if that's the case, then we see that, there hasn't been a wedding and that she is still virginal. Now, one other note is that the word spouse is used here for this one particular Hebrew word, and it's misleading. And this is some of the bias that I was talking about before, because when the translator translates this, they put the word spouse here. Okay, so we're looking at her, quote unquote, as a spouse, even though perhaps she's still, well, I think she is still a virgin here. And whether the verse is alluding to that fact or not, I believe her still to be a virgin. I believe her to be a virgin all the way throughout, if that doesn't give away too much. But the this word is translated spouse 6 times in the Bible. Okay, all of them are right here in Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 8 through chapter 5, verse 1, I believe. So it's translated 6 times as spouse right here, and nowhere else is it translated spouse in the Bible, though in Hosea it's translated spouses, plural, twice. All the other times it's translated either daughters-in-law, which is kind of interesting, kind of connoting and meaning the son's wife, right? So it's really speaking of her as a wife. But this time here is talking about bride. That's the other translation and probably the better word here. Now, a bride can be somebody just before, during the ceremony, or after the ceremony. These are all appropriate terms for the word bride. So I think bride is a better translation right here for this, the word that's translated 6 times just right here, because of, I believe, the biases that the translators had. And again, I don't fault them too much, because they're trying to put this all together and try to make it easier for us. So then we get all the way down to the bottom to chapter 4, verse 16, and I think we see a transition. And in my Bible, there's a section heading there that they put for just a single verse, which kind of makes you wonder, okay, should this perhaps be in the next chapter, or was this meant to be completely transitional? And sometimes within the text, there are hints as to where paragraph breaks and whatnot should be. So perhaps they did that based on that to the best they could. But it does seem now at this point that at verse 16 is the daughters of Jerusalem that are now talking. So now we have them talking, and they're saying this, and by what they're saying, you just have to wonder, say, okay, well, who's saying that, or why would Solomon? This is the question I always had to ask. Why is Solomon saying that? Why would the Shulamite be saying that? Why would the daughters of Jerusalem be saying that? And so at this point in time, it just seems to fit, especially when we get to chapter 5, verse 1, which is the next verse. And as we've said many times, often we look at these things, as one singular document. This all the stuff, and it was divided up based on these marks, like I said before, but the verses were never there. They were put in just so that we could find things more easily in terms of combing all this. And I think that overall, I'm not being too negative. They did a really good job about all of this, and it's been very helpful. But sometimes some of these things just throw us off a little bit. So even the context of this next verse, kind of lends itself to actually the daughters of Jerusalem having this chorus and putting it in there. But again, like I said, there's definite room for doubt, even in my mind, in terms of some of these things. But I don't think it takes away too much from the overall understanding. So chapter 5, we have another scenario here. Okay, it's very similar to chapter 3, but in this time, the watchmen of the city beat her up when she goes out looking for a lover. So chapter 5, verse 2 says, I sleep, but my heart is awake. It is the voice of my beloved. So she hears him. He's knocking. But again, this is, she says, I sleep. So he knocks and so on and so forth. And then she goes out looking for him. But this time, the watchmen of the city find her, and they strike her and they wound her, and even take her veil away from her. Then verse 8, once again, she then makes this proclamation to the daughters of Jerusalem, and she says, O daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my beloved, then tell him I am lovesick. And then they start querying her in verse 9. This is the daughters, again, I think just that single verse, 5 verse 9. Said, what is your beloved more than another beloved, O fairest among women? So now there you see a kind of change in their attitude. What is your beloved more than another beloved? Why is he so much better? You have Solomon here, right? Not only that, but Solomon wants you. So why is it that you are fixated on your lover? And so then she answers, and for the rest of the chapter, she's praising her lover, and saying, okay, here's why I think he's great. So then chapter 6 we go over, and of course at the very end of chapter 5, she does address the daughters of Jerusalem again. So chapter 5 verse 16, and then we get to chapter 6 verse 1. It appears to be that the daughters of Jerusalem now are, well, we'd like to know more here, and they say, chapter 6 verse 1, where has your beloved gone, O fairest among women? Where has your beloved turned aside, that we may seek him with you? So now we see, okay, well, they go from just saying, well, if you want a shepherd, there's lots of shepherds over here, to saying, tell us more, and where is he now, that we may seek him? And these are the same women that were previously extolling all the virtues of Solomon, be it most of them were physical. So then in verses 2 and 3, she answers them. And then Solomon kicks in again in verses 4 through 9. And he's trying to impress her. And it's interesting, the way that he goes about it. I'm not sure that this would exactly be the best way. But in verse 8, he talks about there's 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. All these ladies in waiting that want me and desire me just like you should, right? I'm going, okay, not sure that that's the best way to woo her, but this is what he's saying. And also what we see here too is that he already has quite a few women already in his harem. So some want to say, well, this was his first wife, but no, it couldn't be. And so she does seem to be somebody, at least if it's a real situation, that came in the middle or after the fact, after he had all these. So he'd already gone down that road. Now, verse 10, not exactly sure who sings that, but 11 and 12 do appear to be the woman, the Shulamite. And there she's recounting being taken away again. I think this is what she's alluding to in chapter 1 at the very beginning, that the king's taken her away. And then here she is, talking about how before I was even aware, in verse 12, my soul had made me as the chariots of my noble people. And she was taken away. And then verse 13, we finally see where she is named. And I'm assuming at that point that it is the Daughters of Jerusalem chorus that are saying that, in terms of the Shulamite woman, because as we get into chapter 7, this chorus continues through verse 5. It appears to be them talking. And now they're talking a lot about her. And so we see this attitude change as they go through. And then verses 6 through 9, looks like Solomon's trying again. And that's not working so well, obviously. And then verses 10 through 13, the Shulamite woman refuses to compromise. So then finally, chapter 8, we have this final advice and this warning to the daughters of Jerusalem. Now, it seems to be that it's her talking in verses 1 through 7. I'm not sure who's singing in the next verses, though, but some want to say it's her brothers. From, if you want to go back to chapter 1 and verse 6, talks about the brothers and how they made her take care of the vineyard, and she couldn't even take care of her own. But it seems to me to be unlikely that we're going to introduce a whole nother character into this, and that we've had just the three basic ones throughout this whole time, and then to introduce one. And again, it's not outside the realm of possibility, but also I think there's other, how shall we say, literary mechanisms that can be employed or used that would say, oh, okay, well, we're just going to have the chorus, the daughters of Jerusalem, take on this persona, and they're going to say that. Again, all of this is under inspiration of God. So as we talked about and alluded to before, the Bible is given by God and is profitable. And it is God-breathed, implying that God has this direct interaction with it. And by and through the power of his Holy Spirit, these things happen. And so I'm sure that he was intimately involved in this, and that one of the things that I've seen in the past, that God is not juggling with just one ball. I think often we look at some of this stuff and you go, oh, here's the one singular thing that is happening here. No, I think God is, and I know God is multifaceted, working on more things than we realize right now, and things for the future, for things that we don't even know that are going to happen or that we're going to be involved in. And so if we can think of it, all right, in our finite minds, right, these physical minds that are nothing like God's, then yeah, I think God can, by far work in a much more complex manner, and and employ whatever quote unquote literary mechanisms that he wants to. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that it's poor writing. It doesn't mean that that's what's happening. It just means, okay, we're going to have to study it maybe a little bit more and come to a better understanding. So verses 8 through 11, it's unclear, though it really does seem like, say, in verse 10, that it would be the Shulamite woman speaking. And then even in verse 11, that it would be her. I mean, she's now become aware of all these things. But through it all, she continues to be true to her lover. And then she ends up in verse 14 by her last appeal to her lover, make haste, my beloved. So she's still looking forward to when she can be united with her lover. So that is just a quick and brief, hopefully not too quick, not too brief, to give you an overview. And by way of that, I mean an introduction to what we're going to be talking about next week. And I believe that to be the weightier matter, the more meatier matter of what this book is really about, and how it's important to us, and especially at this time of the year.